Hello students, welcome back to my YouTube channel, Your English Teacher. I am Ritu Bhandari and today we are going to study the short answer questions for the chapter The Address by Marga Minko. This is the second chapter of your 11th standard textbook, Snapshots. Before we go on to the question answers, I hope you all have visited this YouTube channel and visited the videos giving the summary of this chapter and another video which is giving a line-wise explanation of the chapter. I hope you have gone through those videos before you have reached this video. After this video, we will also be taking up the long answer questions. So let's go to the first question. Why was the narrator surprised on visiting her home at the wake of the war? Since these are short answer questions, the answers have to be in not more than 40 words. They can be in one paragraph. The narrator was a Jewish family and she was settled in Netherlands. One day when she came home, the narrator saw much of her furniture and crockery was either missing or misplaced. In fact, this disorder was caused by Mrs. Dorling, an old acquaintance of her mother who had been shifting the family's valuables to her home for safekeeping, but the narrator was unaware of it. Coming to the second question. Under what circumstances was the author's family forced to allow the possessions to be carried away? The author's family was in the fear of war. Every second was unpredictable as they could be forced to move from their house. At a time like this, Mrs. Dorling, an old acquaintance of the author's mother, turned up and offered to help them and by keeping their belongings safely till they came back. But actually she had an ulterior motive and had no intention of giving the things back. The third question. Why was the narrator's mother glad to have Mrs. Dorling to help the family? The narrator's mother was very innocent. She was gullible. She easily trusted people. She thought Mrs. Dorling was offering her help to save her family's valuables. She believed that Mrs. Dorling would return the family's valuables once the war is ended. Besides, two of them had been friends years ago, so trusting an old friend at the time of great crisis seemed appropriate. Question number 4. Why did the author first hesitate to claim her belongings from Mrs. Dorling's? See, when the war was over and the narrator began to feel a little bit secure, she thought of going and getting her mother's possessions. On a second thought, she started to suspect that maybe there's a possibility she may not remember the address, and somehow she also was not very sure that she was ready to acquaint herself, go through that emotional turmoil and acquaint herself with her mother's possessions, because her mother was no longer alive and those possessions could actually emotionally overwhelm her. Question number 5. What for did the narrator ring the doorbell? She rang the doorbell because she was at Mrs. Dorling's house, the address where her mother had told that her belongings could be brought home after the war. Why was Mrs. Dorling cautious while opening the door? She was very cautious because she had actually no intention of returning the narrator's things back. When she saw the narrator, she realized that she has come back for her belongings. She blatantly refused to recognize her, and she therefore acted very cautious while opening the door. Moreover, she didn't want anybody inside, especially her daughter maybe, who might have heard somebody at the door. She didn't want her to know about the fact that all the things they had in their house, majority of them were actually Mrs. S's things. Question number 7. For a while the narrator thought she had rung the wrong bell, but soon her doubts had vanished. Why did the narrator initially doubt that she had made an error? How did she know that she had rung the right bell? The narrator had been absolutely certain that this was the address, number 46 Marconi, and she expected the good lady to wait for her and would be willing to give back her mother's possessions. But what happened was something she never imagined. She never knew that Mrs. Darling would turn hostile and blatantly admit she didn't recognize her. And then that made her doubt whether she's gone to the wrong address or not. But when she saw Mrs. Darling wear her mother's green cardigan, she then was very sure that she had rung the right bell. And again, when she looked at the number on the jamb of the door, she realized that definitely she was at the right address. Question number 8. How did Mrs. Darling behave when the narrator visited her address? When the narrator visited Mrs. Darling's address and informed the lady that she was Mrs. S.'s daughter, first of all, she behaved as if she didn't recognize her. She tried to avoid her. And Mrs. Darling said that actually she never hoped that anybody would come back from the war to claim their possessions. Question number 9. Why did the narrator return to her poor dwelling without claiming her family's possessions from Mrs. Darling? The narrator mustered up the courage to visit Mrs. Darling for the second time. But even in the second time, she did not come back with her mother's possessions. She didn't claim them, because that was the place where her mother's possessions had lost their value. That was the place where her mother's possessions were severed from her mother's memories. And she could not understand why, but it was maybe to do with the way it was distastefully arranged, the way it was disrespectfully used, and the way it was in a strange atmosphere, that somehow she could not muster up the courage of emotionally tackling that situation of taking her mother's belongings with her. Her mother's belongings no longer would be accompanied with only her mother's memories. They would also be accompanied with Mrs. Darling and her daughter's association with those things. So they lost their value. Let's go to question number 10. What were the narrator's emotions when she stood in the midst of things that once belonged to her? The first emotions experienced by the narrator were of pain and guilt. As she walked into the living room, she saw all her belongings, and there was a sense of pain, a sense of loss, a sense of separation, and a feeling of guilt also. Guilt for not having cared for the family's possessions. Somehow she thought she should have come a bit earlier maybe, and she felt as if she should have taken care of her mother's possessions way long back. Now she could not muster up the courage. So the emotions were of pain, guilt, and loss. Mrs. Darling's is a typical example of betrayal. Definitely she is, because we can substantiate it with examples from the text. She had offered to take care of the narrator's mother's belongings, but it was all with an ulterior motive. She was very opportunist. She wished, in fact, that none of them would ever return back from the war, and then automatically Mrs. S.'s belongings would become hers. So she, all the way out of the blue, after so many years of acquaintance, suddenly comes up and offers Mrs. S to take care of her things. So it is an example of betrayal. She acted out of pure opportunism and had ulterior motives. Question number 12. Find evidences for the alienation that the narrator suffered in the midst of her belongings. Well, alienation was the moment she entered the room. The moment she entered the room, the moment she saw the green cardigan, she realized that she doesn't belong there. She saw her mother's belongings in the room and she realized she was in a room she did not know and knew. Because her mother's things were there, but somehow they have been severed from her mother's memories. There were a lot of things from the past that were supposed to be associated with her mother's belongings, but now they had gained a new association. And those things had been transformed because they no longer fitted the roles that they earlier had while she was growing up. So in the new house, there were different ways in which these things were being used. And therefore, it seemed as if she was alienated from those things and in turn from her mother's belongings. Why did the narrator find herself in a room she knew and didn't know? Because the moment she walked into a room, she recognized her mother's belongings. From the very moment she stepped into it, she saw the Hanukkah, she saw the teacups, she saw the tablecloth, the plates on the wall, but they all seemed to cause displeasure, oppose her, because it was something to do with the strange smell, the muggy smell in the room, and the distasteful way in which it was arranged, and also the manner in which the daughter was eating from the plate. All that seemed to oppress her. What are the contrasting elements in the characters of Mrs. Dorling and Mrs. S? Well, the contrasting characters, Mrs. Dorling and Mrs. S, are definitely they are contrasting, because Mrs. S was a lady of simplicity. She didn't seem to have the harsh and cruel side of the world. She could easily befriend people, rather easily trust them. She trusted Mrs. Dorling, who was just an acquaintance of her, and allowed her to keep all her precious belongings. Moreover, she was very kind-hearted. She thought that, oh God, how much trouble she's taking to carry all the heavy articles to her home. Whereas Mrs. Dorling was a typical symbol of betrayal and cunningness. She had ulterior motives behind offering to take care of Mrs. S's things, and was an opportunist. Question number 15. Why did the author decide against claiming her family's possessions from Mrs. Dorling? Well, at this time, she was emotionally overwhelmed. She had decided not to take her mother's belongings with her because her mother's belongings had been severed of their value, from their mother's memories. Those things had lost their value in that home. They had developed new roles to play, the things, and they were no longer only associated with her mother, so she decided not to take them. Moreover, she justified saying that she had a small room and the cutlery could not fit in that one drawer she had. But we realize, as a human being, we start justifying what we can't achieve. Justify the title of the story, The Address. The story, The Address, the whole story revolves around this address, because it is this address where the narrator comes to get her mother's belongings. It is this address where the mother's belongings had severed their value and they were separated from her mother's memories. It is this address where the narrator is emotionally overwhelmed when she sees the distasteful way in which her mother's belongings are being displayed and the way they are disrespectfully used, with the lady's daughter eating from the plates that are supposed to be hung on the wall. So this can be taken up as a long answer question. In this you will have 3 paragraphs. In that you'll talk about what is the first paragraph, you'll talk about the address, what the story is about. Second paragraph, how all these things that I told you revolve around the address. And in the third paragraph, it is this place where the narrator has decided to forget, and it is this place from where she has decided to move on for a future life. So I hope, students, you've understood the chapters, and there's a lot of work